Jataka Tales, The Past Lives of Buddha Part 5. These stories understand human nature better than modern society. Kulavaka Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a young Brahmin living in a small village. He devoted himself to living ethically, always observing the 5 precepts and encouraging others through his example rather than through force. While many of the villagers spent their time drinking, fighting, and engaging in harmful behavior, the Bodhisattva consistently chose kindness, honesty, and service to others. Gradually, his conduct began to influence the people around him. Inspired by his example, many of the villagers abandoned their destructive habits and joined him in projects that benefited the community. Together, they repaired roads, dug water reservoirs, improved public spaces, and worked to make life better for everyone. This transformation, however, created an unexpected enemy. The village headman had previously profited greatly from the villagers' bad behavior. He collected fines whenever they broke the law and earned money by selling them alcohol. As the people became more virtuous, his income disappeared. Resentful and seeking revenge, he went to the king and falsely accused the Bodhisattva and his companions of being a dangerous band of thieves. Without investigating the matter or allowing the accused to defend themselves, the king accepted the accusation as truth. He ordered that the Bodhisattva and all his companions be executed by being trampled beneath a royal elephant. The men were brought into the palace courtyard and ordered to lie on the ground. A powerful elephant was then sent forward to crush them. Yet when the animal approached, it refused to step on them. No matter how much the handlers urged it on, the elephant would not harm them. Several other elephants were brought in, but each reacted the same way. The king became suspicious. Assuming the men must be using magic or some secret charm, he ordered that they be brought before him. This time, the Bodhisattva was finally given the opportunity to explain what had really happened. After hearing the truth, the king realized he had been deceived. Filled with remorse, he punished the dishonest headman by confiscating all his wealth and placing him under the authority of the very men he had tried to destroy. The king then granted the Bodhisattva and his companions responsibility over their village. Returning home, the group continued their charitable work. However, they initially refused to allow women to participate in their projects. Later, they began constructing a large rest house at the crossroads of 4 major highways so travelers could find shelter and assistance. One of the Bodhisattva's wives, named Sudhamma, wished to contribute. Knowing that the men would reject her involvement, she secretly arranged with a carpenter building the rest house to create an ornate pinnacle for the roof. She paid him herself and asked him not to reveal where it had come from. As construction neared completion, the carpenter casually suggested that the building would look far better with a decorative pinnacle. The men agreed, but when they asked him to build one, he explained that such a structure required specially prepared wood and would take a very long time to complete. He then mentioned that a ready-made pinnacle was already available. When the men searched for its owner, Sudhamma revealed that she would happily donate it free of charge if she were allowed to share in the merit generated by the project. At first, the men refused because she was a woman, but the carpenter reminded them that spiritual merit was not limited by gender, and that only the highest heavenly realms excluded women. Realizing their mistake, the men accepted her contribution. Seeing this, 2 of the Bodhisattva's other wives also became involved. Sita created a beautiful garden surrounding the rest house, while Nanda dug a lotus pond nearby for travelers to enjoy. A 4th wife, Sujata, chose not to participate in any way. When the Bodhisattva eventually died, he was reborn as Indra, king of the gods. His companions, because of their good deeds and virtue, were also reborn in the heavenly realm under his rule. At that time, however, powerful demons already inhabited parts of that realm. Wanting to establish peace and order, Indra devised a plan. He got the demons drunk, seized them by their feet, and cast them down to their own domain on the lower slopes of Mount Meru. When the demons eventually recovered and realized what had happened, they were furious and prepared to retake heaven by force. They gathered their armies and marched back toward Indra's realm. The Bodhisattva rode out in his magnificent celestial chariot to oppose them, but the battle quickly turned against him, and he was forced to retreat. As he fled, his chariot passed through a forest inhabited by Garudas, mighty bird-like beings. The force of his passage knocked down many trees, causing panic and suffering among the creatures living there. Seeing the destruction he had accidentally caused, the Bodhisattva was overcome with compassion. Rather than allow others to suffer for his sake, he turned his chariot around and resolved to sacrifice himself if necessary. The demons saw him returning and misunderstood what was happening. Believing he had come back with a vast army of reinforcements, they lost their courage and retreated. Thus, without another battle, the Bodhisattva secured victory. Afterward, a magnificent palace of victory, said to be 1,000 leagues high, rose from the earth. To protect the heavenly realm, the Bodhisattva established 5 great guard stations to ensure that the demons would never again threaten it. In time, Sudhama died and was reborn in heaven as one of Indra's attendants. Because of the merit she had earned by contributing to the rest house, she received a palace 500 leagues high adorned with precious jewels. Sita and Nanda were also reborn in heaven, receiving a beautiful celestial garden and a magnificent lake respectively as the result of their own acts of generosity. Sujata, however, who had not participated in the creation of merit, was reborn as a crane living in a forest on earth. When the Bodhisattva discovered her condition through his divine knowledge, he brought her to heaven and showed her its wonders. He encouraged her to live virtuously so that she too could someday return there. She promised she would. To test her sincerity, the Bodhisattva later transformed himself into a fish and lay motionless on the ground where she could see him. Believing the fish to be dead, Sujata picked it up with the intention of eating it. But when the fish suddenly moved, revealing itself to be alive, she immediately released it. The Bodhisattva then revealed his true identity and praised her for respecting life and following the precepts. After that life ended, Sujata was reborn as a potter. Once again, the Bodhisattva decided to test her virtue. Disguising himself as an old man, he entered her city with a cart full of golden cucumbers and announced that he would give them away freely to anyone who faithfully observed the 5 precepts. Many people tried to buy them, but only Sujata came forward honestly, claiming them through her virtue rather than through wealth. Once again, she passed the test. In her next rebirth, Sujata became the beautiful daughter of a demon king. When she reached adulthood, her father gathered many young demon princes and invited her to choose a husband. The Bodhisattva, knowing this event would occur, descended into the demon realm disguised as one of them. Although she did not consciously recognize him, the karmic bond between them remained strong. Drawn to him above all the others, she chose him as her husband. The Bodhisattva then carried her away to his heavenly realm and elevated her to a position of great honor, placing her in command of 25 million celestial dancing maidens. In the lifetime of the Buddha, 2 brothers became disciples and traveled together on a long journey to see him. During the trip, an argument arose between them, and one brother became so resentful that he refused to share his water strainer with the other. Because monks strained their water to avoid accidentally harming tiny living creatures, the brother without a strainer was forced to drink unfiltered water for the remainder of the journey. When the Buddha learned of this, he reprimanded the disciple and reminded him of the seriousness of taking life, even unintentionally. To illustrate the importance of compassion and self-sacrifice, he told this story, showing that in a previous life he had been willing to risk his own safety in order to protect others. Indra's charioteer, Matali, was reborn in that later life as Ananda, one of the Buddha's closest and most devoted disciples. Naka Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a magnificent golden mallard and was chosen by all the birds to be their king. Wise, respected, and admired throughout the bird kingdom, he ruled with fairness and good judgment. He also had a beautiful daughter whom he loved dearly. At some point, the Bodhisattva granted his daughter a special privilege. She could ask for one wish of her choosing. After some thought, she decided that when the time came for her to marry, she wanted the freedom to choose her own husband. Honoring his promise, the Bodhisattva announced a great gathering and invited birds from every corner of the land to attend. Before long, countless species arrived, each hoping to win the princess's favor. The sky filled with brilliant colors and songs as birds large and small assembled before their king. As she looked over the gathering, the princess was captivated by the beauty of a peacock. His dazzling feathers and graceful appearance seemed more magnificent than any of the others, and she chose him as the one she wished to marry. The peacock, overwhelmed with pride and excitement at being selected, immediately began celebrating. He spread his tail feathers wide and launched into an extravagant dance before the entire assembly. In his eagerness to display himself, however, he behaved without modesty or self-restraint, exposing himself in a way that the Bodhisattva considered deeply inappropriate and undignified. Seeing this display, the Bodhisattva realized that outward beauty alone was not enough to make someone worthy. True character required dignity, humility, and self-control. Disappointed by the peacock's vanity and lack of decorum, he withdrew his approval and declared that the peacock was not fit to marry his daughter after all. Instead, he chose a young mallard whose behavior had been respectful, composed, and honorable throughout the gathering. The princess was then given in marriage to him. In the lifetime of the Buddha, the peacock was reborn as a disciple who had taken monastic vows but failed to live according to them. Although he had committed himself to a simple and disciplined life, he accumulated large numbers of robes, kept a storeroom full of food, and even had servants prepare meals for him, behaving more like a wealthy householder than a monk. When the Buddha questioned him about this conduct, the disciple reacted with anger rather than humility. Losing control of himself, he tore off his robes and shouted that he would live however he pleased. Then he ran away naked, abandoning the monastic life and returning to lay existence. Later, some of the Buddha's disciples discussed the incident and expressed surprise at how recklessly the man had thrown away something so valuable. Hearing this conversation, the Buddha told them this story to show that this was not the first time the same individual had lost a great opportunity through a lack of modesty and self-restraint. Samadhamana Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a quail and became the leader of many thousands of quails living together in a great forest. Wise and observant, he constantly looked for ways to protect his flock from danger. At that time, a clever hunter regularly hunted birds in the forest. Rather than chasing them, he used deception. He would imitate the call of a quail so convincingly that nearby birds would gather around him, believing one of their own was calling. Once enough quails had assembled, he would throw a large net over them and capture them all at once. Realizing the threat this hunter posed, the Bodhisattva devised a strategy. He instructed the flock that if they were ever trapped beneath a net, they should not panic or act individually. Instead, every quail should stick its head through the mesh and, at a signal, all should fly upward together at the same moment. By combining their strength, they could lift the entire net into the air. The Bodhisattva further instructed them to carry the net to a thorn bush, where they could drop it. The net would become hopelessly tangled among the branches, forcing the hunter to spend hours untangling it and preventing him from catching any birds that day. The plan worked perfectly. Each time the hunter cast his net, the quails cooperated and escaped together. Day after day, the hunter returned home empty-handed. His wife grew increasingly frustrated and mocked him for his lack of success. Yet the hunter remained patient. He understood something important. As long as the quails remained united, he could not defeat them. But he also knew that sooner or later they would quarrel among themselves, and when that happened, they would become vulnerable. Eventually, exactly what the hunter expected came to pass. One day, while feeding, a quail accidentally stepped on another quail's head. The bird immediately apologized, explaining that it had been an accident. But the offended quail refused to accept the apology. Instead, he became angry and started arguing. Before long, the two birds were exchanging insults, and the disagreement continued far longer than it should have. When the Bodhisattva saw this conflict, he became concerned. He understood that division and resentment weaken any group, no matter how strong it may appear. Realizing that the harmony of the flock was beginning to break apart, he decided to leave that area of the forest and took his own followers elsewhere. Not long afterward, the hunter returned. Once again he imitated the quail's call, and once again many birds gathered. He cast his net over them, just as he had done countless times before. But this time, when the trapped quails tried to escape, they began arguing. Each demanded that another bird start lifting first. Some blamed others for the situation. Others refused to cooperate out of pride or resentment. While they wasted time quarreling, nobody acted. The delay gave the hunter all the opportunity he needed. Before the quails could organize themselves, he gathered up the net and captured them. Because they had abandoned unity, they lost the very protection that had kept them safe. In the lifetime of the Buddha, members of the Buddha's own Sakya clan had become involved in a dispute with a neighboring clan with whom they had previously lived in harmony. Seeing the growing hostility, the Buddha told them this story to demonstrate how conflict and division can destroy even those who appear strong and secure. The stubborn quail who refused to forgive and continued the argument was reborn in that later life as Devdatta, the disciple who would eventually become the Buddha's rival and enemy. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as the royal chaplain and advisor to a king. One day, while walking near a river, he witnessed an event that revealed the dangers of attachment and uncontrolled desire. In that river lived a large fish and his mate. The two swam together constantly, and the male fish was deeply attached to his companion. One day, while they were playfully moving through the water, a fisherman cast his net nearby. The female fish noticed the danger immediately and managed to swim around the net before it closed. But in her haste to save herself, she failed to warn her companion. The male fish, distracted by his affection and attention toward her, did not notice the trap until it was too late. He became entangled in the net and was dragged out of the river. The fisherman threw him onto the riverbank and then went off to gather wood and prepare a fire for cooking his catch. As the fish lay helpless on the sand, awaiting death, he began to lament his fate. At that moment, the Bodhisattva happened to be nearby and heard his cries. Using his wisdom, he understood the thoughts passing through the fish's mind. What surprised him was that the fish was not grieving because he was about to die. He was not afraid of pain nor of losing his life. Instead, he was tormented by a different concern entirely. He worried that his mate might believe he had abandoned her or run away with another fish. Even on the edge of death, his mind remained consumed by attachment and longing. The Bodhisattva felt compassion for him. He understood that dying while overwhelmed by such passion and obsession could lead to an unfortunate rebirth and continued suffering. Wanting to help, he decided to intervene. The fishermen of that region regularly supplied one fish each day to the royal household. The Bodhisattva approached the fisherman and requested that this particular fish be given to him as the day's offering for the palace. The fisherman agreed. Having secured the fish's release, the Bodhisattva sat beside the river and spoke to him about the dangers of attachment. He explained that a mind enslaved by passion cannot find peace, and that clinging too tightly to desire only leads to suffering. The fish listened carefully as the Bodhisattva taught him about self-control, wisdom, and freedom from craving. When the teaching was finished, the Bodhisattva gently returned the fish to the river, allowing him to swim away and continue his life. In the lifetime of the Buddha, the two fish were reborn as one of the Buddha's disciples and the woman who had once been his wife before he entered the monastic life. Although he had left worldly life behind, the disciple sometimes found himself longing for her and remembering their former relationship. Seeing that this attachment was becoming an obstacle to his spiritual progress, the Buddha told him this story. Through it, he reminded the disciple that excessive attachment ultimately leads to suffering and that he had already rescued him from the same trap in a previous life. By reflecting on the lesson, the disciple came to better understand the nature of desire and the importance of letting go. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a quail. He had only recently hatched from his egg and was still extremely young. His wings were too weak for flight, and he could barely move about on his own. While he remained helpless in his nest, a great forest fire suddenly broke out and began sweeping through the wilderness. As the flames spread rapidly, animals throughout the forest fled in panic. Birds took to the sky, deer ran through the undergrowth, and every creature capable of escaping hurried away from the approaching fire. Even the young quail's parents were forced to leave in order to save themselves. The bodhisattva, however, had no way to escape. He could neither run nor fly, and the wall of flames continued drawing closer with every passing moment. Alone in the nest and facing what seemed certain death, he reflected deeply upon the purity of his own heart. Then he performed an act of truth. Calling upon the power of truth itself, he made a solemn declaration based on the virtue and innocence that he genuinely possessed. With complete sincerity, he affirmed the truth of his conduct and invoked that truth as a protection. The power of that truthful declaration produced an extraordinary result. Although the fire continued raging throughout the forest, the flames could advance no closer than 16 lengths from where the bodhisattva lay. A circle of safety formed around him, and while the surrounding forest burned, the young quail remained completely unharmed. In the lifetime of the Buddha was once walking through that very same region while on his morning alms round. During his visit, a forest fire broke out nearby. Some newly ordained disciples, frightened by the advancing flames, hurriedly began creating a counterfire, hoping to burn a protective area before the main blaze arrived. The older and more experienced disciples, however, stopped them. They explained that there was no need for such measures and advised them instead to remain near the Buddha. Trusting their guidance, the monks gathered around him at a particular spot in the forest. As the fire approached, it roared through the surrounding trees with tremendous force. Yet when it reached the place where the Buddha was seated, it stopped. Just as in the distant past, the flames advanced no closer than 16 lengths before dying away. After the fire had passed, the disciples were amazed by what they had witnessed. The Buddha then explained that the event had not occurred because of any special power he possessed in that moment. Rather, it was the result of the act of truth he had performed at that exact location long ago when he had been the young quail. Through the power of that truthful declaration, no fire would burn that spot for an entire aeon. To help the monks understand the deeper cause behind what they had seen, the Buddha told them this story from one of his previous lives. The quail's mother and father were reborn in that later life as the Buddha's own father and birth mother. Sakuna Jataka. In a former life, the bodhisattva was born as a bird and became the leader of a large flock living in a great tree deep within the forest. Through experience and wisdom, he had learned to recognize dangers long before they became obvious, and for this reason the other birds often relied on his judgment. One day, strong winds began sweeping through the forest. As the gusts grew more powerful, the branches of the great tree rubbed violently against one another. While observing this, the bodhisattva noticed something alarming: thin wisps of smoke beginning to rise where the branches scraped together. Immediately, he understood the danger. If the wind continued and the friction increased, the tree could easily catch fire. Knowing that the lives of the flock were at risk, he warned all the birds and urged them to leave at once. Most of the flock trusted his wisdom and followed him without hesitation. They abandoned the tree and flew to a safer place elsewhere in the forest. However, not everyone listened. Some birds believed the bodhisattva was being overly cautious. To them, the smoke seemed insignificant, and they mocked his concerns. Convinced that nothing would happen, they chose to remain where they were. It was not long before the bodhisattva's warning proved correct. The friction between the branches eventually ignited a fire, and the flames quickly spread through the tree. As the blaze intensified, thick smoke filled the air. The birds that had stayed behind became disoriented and blinded by the smoke. Unable to see clearly or find a path to safety, they were trapped among the burning branches. One by one, they perished in the fire, while the birds who had trusted the bodhisattva's advice survived unharmed. In the lifetime of the Buddha, one of the Buddha's disciples was sent into the forest during the rainy season to devote himself to meditation. Shortly after he arrived, the small hut where he was staying burned down, leaving him with no shelter. Forced to sleep outdoors, he endured discomfort, exposure to the weather, and constant difficulties that disrupted his practice. The monk spoke to nearby villagers about his situation, and they promised to build him a new hut. However, each time they were about to begin, another task took priority. First, they needed to irrigate their fields. Then they had to plant seeds. After that, they needed to build fences, remove weeds, and attend to countless other duties. Again and again, they asked the monk to wait just a little longer. The entire 3-month retreat passed this way. No hut was ever built, and the monk's meditation suffered greatly because of the poor conditions. When he finally returned to the monastery, he explained everything to the Buddha and confessed that he had made little spiritual progress during the retreat. The Buddha listened and then told him this story. Through it, he explained that the monk had made the same mistake as the foolish birds. Rather than remain in an unsuitable place while hoping circumstances would improve, he should have recognized the problem early and moved somewhere more conducive to practice. Wisdom often means acting before difficulties become disasters. The birds who followed the Bodhisattva to safety were reborn in that later life as disciples of the Buddha. Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a partridge. He lived in a forest alongside 2 close friends, a monkey and an elephant. The 3 shared a strong bond and spent much of their time together. Despite their differences in size and nature, they treated one another as equals and lived in harmony. As the years passed, however, they began reflecting on the proper way to live. It seemed inappropriate to them that no distinction existed between elder and younger, teacher and student. They concluded that respect and deference should be shown to whoever among them was the oldest. Before they could do this, however, they first needed to determine who had been there the longest. To settle the matter, they gathered beneath a large banyan tree and each recounted their earliest memory of it. The elephant spoke first. He remembered a time when the tree had been so small that he could simply walk over it, and its highest branches barely brushed against his belly. Next, the monkey shared his memory. He recalled sitting on the ground and reaching up to eat fruit directly from the top branches, which at that time were still low enough to touch. Finally, the Bodhisattva spoke. He explained that long before this banyan tree had even existed, there had been another enormous banyan growing nearby. He remembered eating fruit from that ancient tree and later dropping its seeds. One of those seeds, he said, had eventually grown into the very tree beneath which they now sat. Upon hearing this, the monkey and elephant immediately recognized that the Bodhisattva was by far the eldest among them. From that day forward, they treated him with the honor and respect due to a senior. Whenever important matters arose, they sought his guidance and listened carefully to his advice. By recognizing proper seniority and acting with humility, the 3 friends continued to live together peacefully and harmoniously. In the lifetime of the Buddha, a similar situation arose among the monks. On one occasion, while the Buddha and his disciples were traveling, the senior monks arrived last at a town where they intended to stay. The younger monks who had arrived earlier had already occupied all the available lodging and made no effort to reserve suitable accommodation for their elders. As a result, Sariputta, one of the Buddha's foremost disciples, was left without shelter and had to spend the night sleeping beneath a tree. The following morning, when the Buddha learned what had happened, he gathered the monks together and rebuked them for their lack of courtesy and respect. He explained that honoring those who are senior in age, experience, and virtue is an important part of harmonious communal life. To illustrate this principle, he told them the story of the partridge, the monkey, and the elephant, showing that even animals understand the value of respecting seniority. Following this incident, the Buddha established a formal rule requiring monks to offer the best available lodging, food, and water to the most senior members of the community. The monkey in the story was reborn in that later life as Sariputta, while the elephant was reborn as Moggallana, another of the Buddha's greatest disciples. Jataka. In a former life, The Bodhisattva was born as a tree spirit who lived beside a beautiful lotus pond deep within the forest. From his dwelling among the branches, he observed the lives of the animals around him and often witnessed the consequences of wisdom and foolishness alike. Not far away lay a smaller pond filled with fish. During the dry season, however, the water level dropped dramatically. The pond became shallow, warm, and increasingly crowded. Food grew scarce, and the fish worried about their future. A cunning crane noticed their predicament and saw an opportunity to exploit it. Pretending to be compassionate, he approached the fish and told them that he knew of a large lotus pond nearby, filled with cool water and abundant food. He offered to transport them there one by one in his beak. The fish were suspicious. Cranes were natural predators, and they found it difficult to trust him. Seeing their hesitation, the crane proposed a test. He would carry one fish to the lotus pond and then bring it back so it could confirm his story. The fish chose one of the largest among them, a fish too large for the crane to swallow. The crane carried him to the lotus pond and then returned him safely. The fish enthusiastically described the wonderful place he had seen, convincing the others that the crane's offer was genuine. At last, the fish agreed to be moved. The large fish who had served as the scout volunteered to go first. This time, however, the crane had no intention of keeping his promise. Instead of carrying the fish to the lotus pond, he flew to a nearby tree. There he dropped the fish onto a branch, killed him, and ate him. When he finished, he left the bones beneath the tree. One by one, the crane returned to the pond and repeated the deception. Each fish trusted him and climbed willingly into his beak. Each met the same fate. Over time, a growing pile of bones accumulated beneath the tree while the crane grew fat from his treachery. Eventually, only one creature remained in the shrinking pond: a crab. The crab also wanted to reach the lotus pond, but he was far more cautious than the fish had been. He suspected that none of them had survived. Still, he concealed his doubts and told the crane that he would gladly go, but he feared riding in the crane's beak. He explained that he might fall during the journey. Instead, he suggested that he hold onto the crane's neck with his powerful claws. The crane, believing the crab to be harmless, agreed. As they flew, the crab carefully watched their direction. Before long, he noticed they were heading not toward any pond, but toward a tree covered with fish bones. When he questioned the crane, the bird laughed arrogantly and confessed everything. He proudly admitted that he had eaten all the fish and intended to eat the crab as well. The crane expected the crab to panic. Instead, the crab calmly tightened his grip around the bird's neck. "You may have deceived the fish," he said, "but you have not deceived me. If I am to die, you will die first." The crane immediately realized his mistake. Terrified, he begged for mercy and promised to take the crab safely to the lotus pond. But the crab knew he could not trust such a creature. As soon as they landed, he used his powerful claws to sever the crane's neck, ending the threat forever. The Bodhisattva, who had witnessed the entire affair, praised the crab for his intelligence and presence of mind. He then taught the animals of the forest that deceit ultimately brings destruction upon the deceiver. Those who seek to profit through dishonesty eventually create the conditions for their own downfall. The animals listened to his words and applauded his wisdom. In the lifetime of the Buddha, one of the Buddha's disciples was a highly skilled tailor who made robes for many monks. Although talented, he had developed a dishonest habit. When monks brought him new cloth to be sewn into robes, he secretly kept the best material for himself and returned robes made from old, worn cloth. To hide the defects, he coated the fabric with a starch mixture so the flaws would not become visible until after the robes had been washed. News of this behavior eventually reached a simple village tailor who was known for using similar tricks. Curious, he decided to deceive the deceiver. He dressed himself in one of his own cleverly disguised robes and visited the monastery. When the robe-making monk saw the garment, he admired it greatly and wanted it for himself. The village tailor agreed to exchange it for a quantity of brand new cloth. Delighted by what he believed was a favorable bargain, the monk accepted. Only later, after washing the robe, did he discover that it was old and defective beneath the starch coating. Realizing he had been tricked by the very method he used on others, he became the victim of his own dishonesty. When the Buddha heard the monks discussing the incident, he told them this story to show that this was not the first time the robe maker had lived by deception, nor the first time he had been outwitted by the same individual. The deceitful crane was an earlier birth of the dishonest robe-making monk, and the clever crab was an earlier birth of the village tailor who exposed him. Nanda Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a wealthy landowner known for his wisdom and good judgment. Among his friends was an elderly man who had married a much younger woman and had a young son. As the old man grew closer to death, he became increasingly worried about what would happen to his fortune. He feared that after he passed away, his wife would remarry and spend all his wealth instead of preserving it for their son. Wanting to ensure that his inheritance would eventually reach the boy, he devised a plan. The old man secretly buried his treasure, gold, jewels, and other valuables, in a hidden place deep within a forest. Only one person knew the location: his trusted slave. Before dying, he instructed the slave never to allow the land to be sold and to reveal the treasure to his son once the boy reached adulthood. Years passed, and eventually the son became a grown man. One day his mother told him about the hidden fortune and explained the arrangements his father had made. Believing the time had come, the young man asked the slave to take him to the forest and show him where the treasure was buried. The slave agreed, and together they set out. Yet something strange happened when they arrived at the place where the treasure lay hidden. The moment they reached the spot, the slave's behavior completely changed. He suddenly became arrogant and hostile. Instead of showing respect to his master, he began insulting him. "You son of a slave woman," he sneered. "You are not worthy of possessing this wealth." The young man was shocked but chose not to argue. Calm and patient by nature, he pretended not to hear the insults and quietly returned home without the treasure. Few days later they tried again. Once more the slave guided him into the forest. And once more, when they reached a particular spot, the slave's attitude transformed. He became abusive, insulting the young man and refusing to reveal anything about the hidden fortune. Again, the young man returned home empty-handed. Unable to understand the slave's strange behavior, he sought advice from the Bodhisattva, who had been a close friend of his father. After listening carefully to the story, the Bodhisattva reflected on the situation. He reasoned that the slave's sudden arrogance could only come from one source. Whenever he stood near the hidden treasure, thoughts of possessing it himself filled his mind. The temptation of the wealth was making him forget his duty. The Bodhisattva therefore concluded that the treasure must be buried precisely where the slave began speaking rudely. He advised the young man to return to the forest once more. This time, he should carefully watch for the moment the slave's attitude changed. As soon as the insults began, he should start digging right there without waiting for any further guidance. The young man followed this advice exactly. When they reached the forest again, the slave once more became boastful and insulting. But instead of arguing, the young man immediately took a spade and began digging beneath the very spot where the slave stood. Within a short time, he uncovered the hidden treasure. Gold, jewels, and riches emerged from the earth exactly where the Bodhisattva had predicted. The slave's scheme was exposed, and he could do nothing but obey. The young man then had him help carry the treasure back home. Thanks to his father's foresight and the Bodhisattva's wisdom, he inherited his rightful wealth and lived a prosperous life. He used his fortune well, giving generously to others, supporting good causes, and performing many charitable deeds. In the lifetime of the Buddha, one of Sariputta's students accompanied him on a journey during an alms pilgrimage. Ordinarily, the student was humble, respectful, and obedient. Yet while traveling, he received considerable attention and praise from the people they encountered. As a result, his behavior changed dramatically. He became proud, arrogant, and difficult to manage. However, once the pilgrimage ended and he returned to the monastery, his pride vanished and he returned to his usual humble self. When the Buddha heard about this unusual transformation, he told this story to explain that the disciple had displayed the same pattern in a previous life. The slave in the story was an earlier birth of that student, whose behavior changed whenever he found himself close to something he desired. Katarangara Jataka. In a former life, the Bodhisattva was born as a royal treasurer, one of the wealthiest men in the kingdom. Although he lived surrounded by luxury, his true treasure was neither gold nor property, but his unwavering commitment to generosity and virtue. He faithfully kept the precepts, gave freely to those in need, and never hesitated to support those who lived noble and spiritual lives. One day, Apaksabuddha, a solitary enlightened being who discovers the truth on his own but does not teach it to the world, emerged from a deep meditative absorption that had lasted 7 days. Having taken no food during that time, he set out on his alms round and eventually arrived at the Bodhisattva's residence. But Mara, the embodiment of delusion and the enemy of all goodness, saw what was happening. Believing the holy man would perish if he did not receive food that day, Mara decided to interfere. Using his supernatural powers, he created a vast pit of blazing coals directly inside the palace grounds, separating the Bodhisattva from the Paksabuddha. The Bodhisattva immediately understood what this obstacle was. Rather than retreating in fear, he resolved that no illusion, no danger, and no force in the world would prevent him from performing an act of generosity. Taking a bowl of food in his hands, he walked straight toward the flames. The moment his foot reached the burning pit, a magnificent lotus flower rose from beneath him and held him safely above the fire. With every step, another lotus appeared, carrying him across the inferno. Reaching the Paksabuddha, he respectfully placed the offering into his bowl. The enlightened sage accepted the gift and immediately rose into the sky, traveling away upon a pathway of clouds. Mara's scheme had failed completely. Defeated and powerless, he vanished. Standing upon the lotus, the Bodhisattva then spoke to all those who had witnessed the event. He taught them that generosity rooted in wisdom can overcome even the greatest obstacles, and that true virtue becomes strongest precisely when it is tested. Many lifetimes later, during the time of the Buddha, a wealthy merchant named Anathapindika became famous throughout the land for his extraordinary generosity. He devoted immense resources to supporting the Buddha and the Sangha, often giving far beyond what most people considered reasonable. Living above one of the gateways of his vast mansion was a fairy who did not share his faith. She grew increasingly annoyed by the constant visits of the Buddha and his disciples, and she could not understand why Anathapindika continued giving away so much wealth. At first she tried persuading his family and servants to stop him, but nobody listened. Even when Anathapindika's fortune began to decline because he cared more about helping others than accumulating wealth, his generosity never wavered. Seeing this as her opportunity, the fairy appeared before him and urged him to stop supporting the Buddha. She warned him to think about his future, his wealth, and his family rather than continuing his donations. Anathapindika was horrified by her advice. His faith in the Buddha was absolute, and he considered her words deeply misguided. He immediately expelled the fairy and her children from his home. Homeless and ashamed, the fairy sought help from various heavenly beings, but none were willing to intervene after hearing what she had done. Eventually she approached Indra, king of the gods, who offered her a path toward redemption. Indra explained that Anathapindika had many unpaid loans scattered throughout the kingdom and had also lost several hidden treasure caches over the years. If she truly wished to make amends, she should recover his wealth and restore what had been lost. The fairy followed this advice. Using her supernatural abilities, she located forgotten treasures and persuaded debtors to repay what they owed. Before long, Anathapindika's fortune had been restored. Only then did she return and ask forgiveness. She admitted that she had been blinded by attachment, fear, and ignorance. She confessed that she had failed to recognize the greatness of the Buddha and the value of generosity. Anathapindika accepted her sincerity but asked her to accompany him to the Buddha so she could confess her actions directly. When she did, the Buddha taught that harmful actions often seem beneficial before their consequences mature, while acts of virtue can appear difficult or costly before their rewards become visible. Yet in the end, goodness always bears good fruit. The fairy wept, apologized, and received forgiveness. Later, Anathapindika felt proud that he had remained loyal despite the fairy's attempts to sway him. Seeing this subtle pride arise, the Buddha gently corrected him. Remaining steadfast while living in the presence of a fully enlightened Buddha was admirable, he explained, but there had been times in the distant past when even greater faith had been required. To illustrate this, the Buddha revealed the story of his own previous life as the royal treasurer who had walked through Mara's fire. In that life, there had been no Buddha in the world to guide him, no teacher to reassure him, and no certainty beyond his own conviction in what was right. Yet even then, he had chosen generosity over fear, virtue over safety, and compassion over self-preservation. And just as Mara's flames could not stop him then, neither could doubt, poverty, or temptation stop those who truly understand the value of giving.